Thank you so much, Chris, for the kind introduction. I want to also thank the rest of the organizing committee for the kind invitation, and then others. It's really great. I've been to most of the talks so far in both days, and it's really wonderful to see how the diverse drug communities can come together in this type of forum. So with the last talk of the session and of the conference, I'm going to be bringing to you today life cycle management, developing and bringing innovative medicines to market. So we're going to focus on lifecycle management drivers for 505(b)(2) applications. We'll go a little bit into what those 505(b)(2) applications are, look at it from multiple angles, both the development, regulatory, as well as commercial considerations, and what are the 505(b)(2) trends in the industry. So there's three different types of regulatory pathways. There's the branded focus, which is 505(b)(1) regulatory pathway. There is a generic pathway, which is 505(j). And then there's the 505(b)(2) pathway, which I like to call life cycle management. And with a 505(b)(2) application, and as we get to later in the presentation, you'll see that it could be a first in type of strategy or even a last out type of strategy, depending on the type of application and the product and its patent landscape. It does follow a NDA pathway, new drug application, and you can get regulatory exclusivity if certain safety and efficacy studies are performed. If only BE study is done, a bioequivalency study, no exclusivity can be obtained, and therefore, a generic drug could be imminent. The development times, we'll go into details later, but they are shorter than a branded and typically are longer than a generic. We'll also take a look at the commercial considerations as well as the relative risk, cost, and return on investment. So 505(b)(2)s at a high level, basically the application describes a drug with substantial differences from the reference listed drug. It could be a new dosage form, a new indication, new concentration, formulation, or a new fill volume. And the applicant is supporting these differences in that application with appropriate safety and effectiveness information from the brand. The 505(b)(2) relies on the finding of safety and effectiveness of the RLD only to the extent that that 505(b)(2) product and RLD are the same. And to the extent that the products are different, the 505(b)(2) NDA, like the standalone NDA, must include sufficient data to demonstrate that those B2 products meet the approval standards for safety and effectiveness. So let's dig a little bit deeper into the drivers for 505(b)(2) applications. You could have a change in dosage form from a solid oral to an injectable, change in dosage strength, let's say from a 50 mg per mil to 100 mg per mil solution. The dosing regime could be changed from once a day to twice a day, or twice a day to once a day. Reformulation and changing the release profile. Maybe something originally had a burst and now it has a lower burst and a different type of profile, and so on and so forth. And, for a 505(b)(2), it should meet a significant unmet need, right, to the patient or healthcare staff left by the brand. So there has to be some value there that the customer is going to gain. And the customer, for example, if you're in a hospital space, it'll be the healthcare staff, those that would be preparing the medicines, or maybe they don't have to prepare the medicines and it would be ready to use or ready to administer, right, for like an anesthesiologist, for example, or in the emergency room on a crash cart. It could include a technical innovation barrier, and it could offer some type of regulatory exclusivity if safety and efficacy studies are conducted. So with the 505(b)(2), it shouldn't just simply be a better mousetrap, right? There has to be some inherent value to the customer. And there are a lot of possibilities, but it really depends on the application. As mentioned before, changing the dosage form, right? It could be changing the route of administration. It could be a combination product combining two different approved APIs. And also it could be, changing the dosing regime. So let's take a look at the standard development time. The branded drug typically is along the lines of somewhere 5 to 15 years for standard development time, and the development costs are relatively high, a billion plus, as opposed to a generic where you may have a more straightforward type of generic where it's on the order of 1.5 to 3 million. The development cost, complex GX, though, could be much greater, depending on the type of complex generic that is being developed and assuming if additional infrastructure costs need to be in place. But going to 505b2s, you can look at them as two diverse sets. One is without any clinical studies, and standard development time is somewhere 2 to 3 years. And with a clinical study, depending on the type of clinical study and clinical study design, it could range anywhere from 4 to 7 years. Development costs are also varied as well too. Once again, it depends on the number of strengths, but let's assume that there's 2 strengths. Without clinical studies, the costs are somewhere between 2 to 5 million. And it also depends, right, if it's in-house capabilities or you're going to be working primarily with CMOs. If you are going to be working with CMOs, the production cost to make the submission batches could be two-thirds higher on an estimate. With clinical studies, on the other hand, depending on the therapeutic area, depending on the type of clinical study and how it's powered, they could be somewhere between 20 to 80 million dollars. And the relative risk is that with the ready to use, ready to administer type of products, let's say injectable solutions, you would not need any clinical studies. But let me maybe explain a little bit about ready to use, ready to administer. Ready to use means that you have a powder that's already dissolved in the liquid, let's say in a pre-filled syringe, and then the healthcare administrator has to do another step in the hospital. Ready to administer means that it's already in the final primary pack and it can be administered as is. So there's a ready to use and ready to administer. And then on the moderate to high side, these are 505b2s that in which there may be a new excipient, new route administration, and this is where it requires safety and efficacy studies. So some regulatory considerations, some highlights is that with 505b2s, you're still going to need 3 batches for submission with 12 months of data. And some other differences that exclusivity can be possible with 3 years, up to 3 years with clinical studies. On the opposed to 505J, if you're first to file, you get 180 days exclusivity, or if you go the CGT route, you could also get 180 days exclusivity. The filing costs are also different. For a 505J, it's somewhere in the magnitude of 200,000, and for the 505b2, it's about 1.5 million without clinical studies, 2.9 million with clinical studies. Goal dates are about the same, and the cost for the program fees for 505b2 per strength per product is $336,000. Now, when one puts together a business case, they should take this into consideration, not only the development cost, but also the regulatory filing costs to see what the break-even analysis would be. Submission process. So with the 505J, there is no pre-IND meeting. With a 505B2, with or without clinical studies, is a pre-IND meeting prior to IND submission. And these pre-IND meetings really are helpful, right? So you initiate before you start initiating formulation development significantly. It gives you kind of a strategy, helps you better define what studies might be needed and require for approval. And so obtaining this input from the FDA can be vital for securing the investments that might be needed in order to advance the program forward. Prior to submission, 6 months before submission, the NDA, there is a pre-submission meeting, as opposed to a 505J. It's not a mandatory meeting. If it's a complex product, you could request a pre-submission meeting, but it may or may not be granted. But for a 505B2, there is a pre-submission meeting. In regards to FDA interactions, in short, the interactions are much faster. The expectations are much higher. The FDA expects that these questions are answered relatively quickly, as opposed to the generics where there is a longer lead time for answering the questions, like for example, on information requests. So now we get to the topic of the therapeutic equivalence. So they're eligible for AB rating, same as an ANDA, but it's not guaranteed. Here, while many 505(b)(2) NDAs are approved for drug products that differ pharmaceutically from another drug product, they may not be eligible for the therapeutic equivalence rating. However, 505(b)(2) NDAs approved for drug products that are pharmaceutically the same as the reference listed drug, RLD, can be eligible for therapeutic equivalence. This is really important, especially if you're not in the hospital or institutional space where substitutability is going to be super important, because from a marketing and sales perspective, there might be a lot more heavy lifting without that substitutability, especially if you're going to be like in a retail market. FDA does not automatically undertake an evaluation to assign a therapeutic equivalency rating for a 505(b)(2) application like they do for 505(j) applications. Therapeutic equivalence may be requested with respect to a 505(b)(2), but only post-approval. So when you do have, have a specific business case in mind, right, that needs to be taken into consideration. What if, it's not going to be AB rated versus if it is going to be AB rated, and when would it be AB rated? So an applicant seeking to have this therapeutic equivalence may petition the agency through the citizen petition procedure. Just kind of some information, some facts here is, there's multiple examples where, for example, a company has requested the FDA to assign in the agency's Orange Book a TE code of AP to a certain product. However, there are multiple examples where a petition might have been filed, let's say in September 2019, but the FDA still has not made a decision on the TE code and has not yet been assigned. So that's something for one to consider if there is going to be a 505(b)(2) where therapeutic equivalence is absolutely necessary in order for driving the positive NPV analysis. A little bit more on therapeutic equivalence, requirements for TE ratings of 505(b)(2)s, the product is approved as safe and effective. It's pharmaceutically equivalent in that the product contain identical amounts of the same active ingredient in the same dosage form and route of administration, and meets applicable standards of strength, quality, purity, and identity. The products are bioequivalent, products are adequately labeled, and the product is manufactured in compliance with CGMP regulations. So that's a little bit more substance around the therapeutic equivalence. Some examples of 505(b)(2) applications that are AB rated, are multiple examples. I believe as of February 2016, a total of 83 products for which a TE code has been assigned. Similar number of 505(b) products receive an AB code, which is about 35, as a combined number of other products receiving other codes like AA, AN, AO, AP, around 36. So that's a little bit more information around that. And as we progress, let's take a look at some of the commercial considerations. And in regards to the commercial considerations, this is really, really important here around, if we're taking a look at a 505(b)(2) without any clinical studies and it doesn't have an AX rating, it will not be substitutable and not eligible to be therapeutically equivalent as indicated before, and will require promotion. And as opposed to if it's substitutable with an AX rating, once again, after submitting a citizen's petition and getting the favorable information from the FDA, and it goes through the retail channel, no promotion. If it goes through a specialty channel, it still may require some level of promotion. As with generics, it may have to go through some sourcing programs and have special requirements like REMS or additional services to match the brand level services. If it's in the hospital or institution or clinics and it doesn't have AX rating, it's not the end of the world there. The institutions and the P&T committee, which is the Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee, they make the decision typically on the number of products in the formulary. And it really depends on the product, the extent of promotion and payer presence that would be required. And some examples here might be a certain drug product that is available in a vial at a certain concentration in, let's say, 3 mils. And now a certain company wants to put that product in a pre-filled syringe at the same concentration, but in 5 mils, a 5 mil pre-filled syringe. And that would be a 505b2 product, same concentration, but different fill volume. There might even be some cases, same concentration, same fill volume, going to a different primary pack because of what else might be in the formulation, and it would still trigger it to be a 505b2. Substitutable with AX rating, should not require promotion, as could have the same coding, the HCPCS coverage and reimbursement as the brand. And then with clinical studies, it's not substitutable, that requires, promotion and a sales force. Why 505b2 applications? So here, 505b2 regulatory pathways become very attractive to companies of all sizes. It can really remove the uncertainty in the development regulatory pathway and potential lower development costs, as mentioned before, compared to branded products, filed via 505b1. It could really be an attractive pathway for manufacturers transitioning from generic drugs and also to the innovator type products or complementing their GX portfolio. They may offer lower risk to market entry point and unique scientific, regulatory, marketing, and sales and financial considerations to developing such products. That's basically building the business case. So here, the scientific aspects are super important. Is it feasible to develop a product that has a certain shelf life? Or it may need, for example, to go from alleviating cold chain to room temperature stability. From a regulatory perspective, we're trying to achieve a 505, go down a 505b2 pathway. What are the additional studies that might be needed? What are the costs of those studies? What are the lead time for those studies? Do we need, a sales force? What type of sales force will we need? What type of lifting will we need in order to generate the sales that are desired? And other financial considerations for developing such products. So if we take a look at some additional pros and cons here, for 505b2s, there is less data required in the application than 505b1, because you're leveraging on some of the safety and efficacy data. It's not blocked by exclusivity of a generic drug product and possibly earlier market entry. And there are several examples where 505b2s have launched in some cases prior to brand exclusivity and launched, ahead of GX entries. That could be like glucagon, capsifungin, indomethacin, and some others. That's kind of like the first in strategy I was referring to before. It may list patents covering the changes, and as we discussed prior, may receive exclusivity 3 years with the clinical studies. On the con side, patent certification is still required, which leads to 30-month stay and possible legal action against a 505b2 applicant. The tentative approval is possible with any P4 certification. Generic competition will be there if there is no exclusivity, and the applicants can file an ANDA against the 505b2 as soon as the product is launched, depending on the exclusivity available. It may not be substitutable and may require promotion, especially if it's not in a hospital institution setting. As mentioned before, does not necessarily need to be AP rated for a hospital institutional setting, and limited promotion may be required, especially if there is presence already with that particular hospital or hospital system. And the regulatory submission costs and program fees need to be taken consideration into the business case, especially if there's a specific product where you might be developing, with multiple strengths, 4 or 5 strengths, then you're going to be paying, the one-time submission fee, and then you're going to pay the yearly fee on each of the different strengths. As we go to the trends, with 505b2 applications, here I show information from 2 different articles from 2009 all the way to 2020, and you can see by and far, right, the 505b2s, there's more applications than the 505b1 new molecular entities, And the proportion of total applicants approved as 505b2 NDAs on an annual basis remained fairly consistent over 7-year period from like 60 to 70% from 2009 to 2015. Then if we look at the time period 2017 to 2020, overall NDA approvals granted by CDER held steady at 114 NDAs, similar to 2019. And moreover, the approvals via the 505b2 regulatory pathway continues to account for well over 60% of all NDA approvals. And excuse me, the most common changes from the reference drug as defined in the 505b2 guidance were for new formulations, 38%, new dosage forms, 37%, and new combinations. Let's take a look at that percentage, how that compares to 2020. So if we take a look at the 505b2s, the NDAs approved in 2020, again, new formulations is at the top of the list, 29%, new dosage form, 24%, and new molecular entity, 18%, new combination, 9%. Let's speak a little bit about the review time. So the median review time for ANDAs increased by 1 month from 10 months in 2019 to 11 months in 2020. Also, more than half, 55% of all 505b2 NDA approvals had review times 12 months or less, down from 71% in 2019. The 505b2 NDAs had review times of 6 months or less, 2 of which were priority review products. So let's speak a bit about the 505b2 NDA's bridging approaches. So if you take a look from this article here, in about 70%, a scientific bridge was established between by a single dose BABE study comparing the PK, that's a pharmacokinetics of the new product, and the listed drug, which is in line with the FDA draft guidance for industry on applications covered by Section 505b2. So when you're planning to create a 505b2 development program, you must determine how the new drug product is different and similar to the innovator drug, especially in relation to pharmacokinetics, that's a PK characteristics. From there, you can leverage all the information relevant to the new drug product by creating a PK bridge, linking the in vivo performance of the new drug product to that of the innovator drug product. By understanding how to best link the two products is an essential step in maximizing the full streamlining capability of the 505b2 approach. And this could be one of the bases, right, of your value proposition. Having a robust PK development plan in your 505b2 strategy, once again, discussed with the FDA in the pre-IND meeting, allows for rapid advancement of the regulatory approval process at a lower cost. For example, when considering oral products, PK studies that address bioequivalence, bioavailability, multiple dose PK, and or food effect can often meet the minimum PK requirements, and something that should be considered as part of the overall business plan. There's many examples of approved 505b2 applications, and here I listed a few, and then I also showed some of them that required, right, the preclinical studies versus PKBE studies versus clinical studies, and the date that were approved. But I give some more recent examples as well. Several companies have successfully utilized, this approach, the 505b2 approach, in order to receive approval for drugs that are currently on the market. Bendeka, there is Omnitrope, Narcan, and Yosprala, for example. So there's many different examples, as mentioned before. 60%, right, of these NDA applications, right, are coming from 505b2s, and could be one of the pillars of a company's, development and strategy in order to develop and bring innovative medicines to market. So I'd like to close and speak a bit more about the strategy piece here. So, firstly, before one develops a product, there needs to be a sound and robust target product profile. TPP. It should be created based on the inputs from portfolio, commercial, and medical affairs, and further refined by the regulatory and development teams. There should be a clear medical viability, right? Establishing a clear niche for the product, such as a solution for an unmet need, right? There has to be a value proposition there, either to the patient or healthcare staff. In addition to the risk-benefit profile and the appeal to the proposed patient healthcare staff, this should also be considered in the value proposition. Also, determining the commercial viability is super important of a viable market for the product and assessing the potential for future competition or substitution, as well as what is needed to ensure reimbursement and the optimal pricing, which is important to the business case build. Really understanding, what are the, what's the brand sales, the other generic alternatives that are available, and possibly there could be even some other 505b2 alternatives available and generics of those 505b2s available. So would another 505b2 provide that adequate value proposition that would have solve some type of unmet need for either the patient or customer, and that customer could be healthcare staff. Scientific justification is also super important, right? Once an idea comes across the desk, a paper assessment of the probability of success, coupled with some feasibility experiments leading to a successful proof of concept to be further endorsed for a full development project, is to be considered. Contribution of the development team for further refinement of the TPP and business case build is also super important, because you could have, for example, a molecule. It would be great to put it into a solution, but it's really prone to hydrolysis. So how can you stabilize a solution that's still marketable, right? That has some type of minimum marketable shelf life, let's say 16 months, for example, without it degrading significantly? Would that mean putting in a new excipient to help stabilize? Well, if you do that, do you need to do you have to do additional studies? How much would those studies cost? Is it going to be viable? And that also leads to the probability of success. And then finally, the regulatory viability needs to be considered as well, right? Determining the availability of data required that may be used to gain approval, and distinguishing that information that could be presented on the labeling for future promotional activities should also be considered. And that mainly holds true, right? For example, for something in which it might be like for a new indication or a new type of dosing regime. So we're left with kind of this balancing act here between, standard generics, right? I would put the 505b2s with clinical studies on that spectrum. And then there's the complex generics. I would put 505b2 products with clinical studies on that side of the spectrum. And it's really a balancing act between, if you do have a 505b2 without clinical studies, it might lead to, might be lower risk. It might have a lower development price tag to it, lower investment. As opposed to something with a 505b2 with clinical studies, it could generate a higher profit, higher risk profile. It would require a different type of technical expertise as well, higher investments. So it's a strategic decision that a company needs to make. And how do you balance that with the overall portfolio, including standard generics, complex generics, 505b2s with clinical studies, and 505b2 without clinical studies? With that, I'd like to end my talk. Thank you all for your kind attention. I want to thank the organizers again for doing a great job in organizing this 2-day conference. And I want to thank all my colleagues at Sandoz that helped provide inputs into this presentation. Thank you.